This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this event, this Institute for the Study of the Americas event, which is being operated under the aegis of the Institute's United States Presidency Centre. I can see quite a few familiar faces in the audience, and welcome back to you. But for those of you who are here for your first time, a warm welcome, and I hope it won't be the last time that you're here. I'm just going to start before the main proceedings of the evening with a little advert for a forthcoming event. Everyone in this room, I assume, has a particular interest in the United States, and 2 weeks today, on February the 2nd, we have a debate on is the United States in decline? And speaking for the motion will be Adam Quinn, who is here on the far right, but not politically the far right, and myself. And speaking against the motion will be Professor Mick Cox and Nick Kitchen of the LSE. So it promises to be an exciting evening, and I hope that some of you who are here tonight will be able to attend that. But we hear that's just an hors d'oeuvre for the main course tonight, which is a very important one, and I choose my words suitably because we're here to discuss old wine in a new bottle, ? Democratisation lessons from Afghanistan and Iraq in the Arab Springs, Libya. My job is to chair the event. Should have said who I was, automatically expecting everyone to know, but for those of you who don't, I'm Iwan Morgan. I'm head of the US programs at the ISA. And my job will be to chair this event. The event is to celebrate the publication of Matt Hill's book, my colleague Matt Hill's book, Democracy Promotion and Conflict-Based Reconstruction, the United States and Democratic Consolidation in Bosnia, Afghanistan and Iraq, published by Routledge at £85, but with a massive discount for those of you interested, which you can purchase the book tonight for £60. Worth every penny, I'm told by the authors.
I think that's even more of a discount.
Oh, okay, I'm just looking at what's here.
Yeah, I know.
But I'd like to congratulate Matt on the publication of his first book. I'm sure it'll be the first of numerous ones. It's based on his PhD dissertation, and we'll have a very brief presentation of that from Matt, 10-15 minutes, outlining his key argument and looking at how it might be applied to Libya. And I'm delighted that we have two very distinguished speakers in support of Matt tonight, who have come here both to comment on his book and to comment on the Libyan intervention. On my left is David Chandler, who is Professor of International Relations at the Centre for the Study of Democracy in the University of Westminster. Professor Chandler is a prolific author. I won't spend time reading off the titles he's written, but among the key ones are Empire in Denial, The Politics of State Building, which came out in 2006, Constructing Global Civil Society, Morality and Power in International Relations. And in addition to the books he's written, he has published in some of the key international journals. And I'm delighted to welcome somebody who will be back here in 2 weeks' time to be my lead in the debate of whether America is in decline. We have Adam Quinn, who is a lecturer in the Political Science Department in Birmingham. Adam is a PhD from the London School of Economics, and he has written extensively on US foreign policy, and he has a book out which was also published by Routledge, which seeks to locate the controversial national security strategy of the George W. Bush administration within the longer-term context of American liberal thinking. And that book is entitled US Foreign Policy in Context, National Ideology from the Founders to the Bush Doctrine, which came out in 2010, and I can testify that it is an absolutely riveting read.
And that one's only 30 quid.
But that was even better. We're going to have Matt go first, obviously. He will then be followed by Adam, and we'll have David Chandler last but not least. And then we'll open out to a question and answer session, and if you don't get the opportunity to ask a question, there will be a reception outside afterwards, but I'm sure you can buttonhole the speakers to your heart's content. Okay, so without further ado, Matt, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ewan. And also thank you for attending. As Ewan said, what I'm going to do is talk briefly to outline the book for people, and hopefully we can use that as a framework for this discussion. So it looks at US democracy promotion, and I apologise for the size of the title. I was told that the amount of keywords were important for determining it. But it looks, the book looks at US democracy promotion in Bosnia, Afghanistan and Iraq. And so for Bosnia it looks at it during the Clinton administration, and for Afghanistan and then later Iraq it looks at it during the Bush administration. And it's about comparing those two administrations' types of democracy promotion, and are they the same, or are they essentially similar? A couple of things. First of all, what do I mean by democracy promotion? Well, the main thrust of the book is actually looking at disaggregating democracy promotion into what I would say is democracy assistance programs and projects. And there's predominantly four main areas of how the hierarchy of these four areas go. So you have the overall program area, which is effectively your aim, which is to promote a liberal democracy. Then you have specific program areas. So you have physical reconstruction, you have political liberalisation, and you have economic liberalisation. And then you have sub-program areas, which would be projects. So this is implemented by the US government. So you would have, for example, the development of an independent media, or the development of an electoral program. And so then you would then have individual projects which would look at, for example, voter education, technical developments of media, how to operate machines, media machines like TVs, cameras, how to run a newspaper, and so forth. So in the book can be broken down into three phases, and in the first phase I examine the role of transition theory in US democracy promotion, and there are three elements to what is determined as a transition-based program. Now, transition theory, first of all, is it makes a number of assumptions, and they are first that you can develop institutions, and you can develop the electoral system in a country. Second of all, it supports the development of civil society. So a civil society which is capable of connecting with the institutional framework in order to have a successful democratic consolidated state. So it's not only the institutional framework, but it's also the cultural aspect which is important. So the development of liberal normative behaviour would be one way of looking at it. And then finally, transition theory supposes that you can actually promote democracy in any country at any time of its development. So irrespective of the structural conditions, it can be transplanted, or a friend of mine once said, it can be parachuted in. So it's the idea that you can pick it up and you can just run with it in any country. So these are the kind of the assumptions about what a transition-based democracy promotion mission would look like. And so I conclude that in the cases of Bosnia, Afghanistan and Iraq, it's transition-based. Their democracy promotion missions are transition-based. Now, in the kind of tail end of this phase, what I look at is transition. I look at a current debate in transition theory, which is between the one-size-fits-all and the case-specific. Now, just a couple of points on that. The one-size-fits-all is a criticism of current US democracy promotion, in that it makes an assumption that irrespective of the local conditions in a country, so irrespective of the structural issues in a country, what will happen is that they will just come in and implant the same kind of democracy building program in country X as they would in country Y. So irrespective of what those local conditions are, they'll still use the same, predominantly the same kind of structure of the democracy program. The case-specific is in opposition to that. And the case-specific says that actually what happens in contemporary US democracy promotion is that in contemporary democracy promotion, actually what happens is that there's impact assessments or assessments where people go into the country and they examine the local conditions, and then they tailor-make, say for example, an independent media program to fit the conditions within that country. And so this is the kind of the arena of the debate. And my conclusions are that, that although there was a response to local conditions in the case of US democracy promotion in Bosnia, Afghanistan and Iraq, nonetheless it did employ a one-size-fits-all approach, or other people have used the terminology of blueprint approach, which is imposed on from the US government in DC. So, in the second phase, I suggest I look at the US missions in a very focused way, and I look at these what I talked about earlier, these various areas of program areas, sub-program areas, individual projects. I look at specific examples of that, and I do so for the US Agency for International Development. So I look at those programs that they implemented in Bosnia, Afghanistan and Iraq, and I examine, I first have a question is, do these programs lead to the consolidation of democracy in these three countries? And I use a framework that Roland Paris has used. And using that framework, I suggest that actually democracy is not consolidated in these three countries. And not only that, the democracy programs that they've implemented have actually hampered the transition to democracy. So it's actually a kind of like a paradox. The actual programs implemented to develop democracy have actually caused a furthering away of getting the prize goal, which is the consolidation of democracy in these three countries. And so I look at specific areas in this phase. I also suggest that the reason why these programs fail is because they do not sufficiently attend to the development of a social and political culture that are capable of supporting the institutions that are being set up. For example, you know, it's about, the idea is that about creating a liberal culture which is able to have a social contract with other people, to have a social contract which means that democracy and democratic institutions are, as Georg Sorensen says, the only game in town. And in examining this, I suggest that the product of these three countries, and this is the democracy with objectives, you know, there's lots of different, like if you read the literature, there's lots of different ways of saying this. So if you look at Zachariah, you could say, you could look at illiberal democracy. If you look at Georg Sorensen, you could say restricted democracy. If you go with Caldor et al., you can say formal democracy. So basically what it's saying is that it's neither a consolidated democracy nor is it a dictatorship. So it's somewhere in between. I think Thomas Carruthers calls it the grey zone. So you have, I think the terms are dominant power politics and feckless pluralism, which are not really positive ways of describing the political system. And then I make some inroads into determining why. this happens. And so I say that I look at the relationship between the local actors and the international actors. And this is something that I want to develop further for looking at the conclusions in the case of Libya. And so when we say local actors and international actors, it's about looking at the power dynamics of that relationship. Who's in control of deciding? So you've got the US government have asked the USAID, the Agency for International Development, to implement a number of programs in Afghanistan, for example. And then it contracts to a US company, for example, I don't know, Commonics International or one of these other organisations, that then implements a series of programs. Now, the question is, what are those individuals at those very different levels of government, how are they, and implementation, how are they interacting with local actors? Who are these local actors? And these are some of the questions that are kind of being raised from the research. So, briefly, finally, in the final phase, I examine okay, so we have this formal democratic or restricted democratic product in these three countries. So then I go, well, I question if there is literature out there by the US government, by the democratization field and by people like myself and David and other people that are saying that that there are questions raised with regards to the successful consolidation of democracy in the way in which the Americans and other countries are implementing them. If we're saying that there's these problems, why is it still carrying on? Why are the programs still the same? Why aren't they adapting the programs? And I kind of address that in a number of ways. I think there's a lot more work to be done in this area. Some of the reasons are bureaucratic homogeneity. So the idea that basically you put something in the system and it just spits out the same program, irrespective of the different countries. It doesn't respond to the local conditions. The second part is that is looking at the issue of national interest. What are America's national interests in promoting democracy in Afghanistan or Iraq or Bosnia? And are they being fulfilled, once you determine that, are they being fulfilled by the process of democratization as opposed to the successful consolidation of democracy? So I look at that and I suggest that actually some of the key economic and security interests, such as for Afghanistan, one of the stated claims is that it's no longer a haven for terrorists that are operating in order to attack the United States of America. Well, if that's successfully achieved by the process of democratization, well, does it need to then put the energies into the successful consolidation of democracy? And my suggestion is that it doesn't. And therefore there needs to be a reorganisation of this understanding of where American national interests and the concept of American national values, which are so interwoven in the rhetorical discussions of democracy promotion, that actually you need to split them apart and go, well, what's the priority? Well, any country's priority is national interest over its values. I mean, that would be my conclusion. And so, so there's a recognition in that national interests will always trump values, and that values aspect, the rhetoric aspect of the values is really as a legitimator of what the US actions are in, say, Bosnia, Afghanistan and Iraq. My final thoughts are on applying it to the case of Libya. And this is a kind of a new focus for me. And the key that I wanted to look at, what I want to look at in looking at post-Gaddafi Libya as a case study, is looking at more like the relationship between international actors and local actors, in specific to the rhetorical discussions that Prime Minister Cameron and President Obama have actually talked about in May last year when President Obama came over. And I just want to read out a couple of things, so which kind of like highlight my interest in looking at the case of Libya. So President Cameron, Prime Minister Cameron, said, today we feel just as passionately about extending freedom as those who came before us, but we also know that idealism without realism does no good for anyone. We have learned the lessons of history. Democracy is built from the ground up. You've got to work with the grain of other cultures and not against them. Real change takes time. And then Obama in the same events, but in the joint conference, said, as historic change unfolds across the Middle East and North Africa, we agree that the pursuit of self-determination must be driven by the peoples of the region and not imposed from the outside. But we are both committed to doing everything that we can to support peoples who reach for democracy and leaders who implement democratic reform. So it's very much on the aegis of local actors. So in the coming months and the coming years, the priority for me is actually to ask the question, okay, so how does that happen in international's relations with the Libyan people and the various arms of the Libyan government? You know, does the importance of local actors driving actually permeate into the individual projects and programs where actually Libyan people are saying, well, these are the kinds of programs we want implemented, you know, in the different areas, like the economic, the physical reconstruction, and the political reform. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Matt. Okay, we'll pass on to Adam.
Right, thank you very much. And before I start, I would like to thank very much Matt for having me along here to comment on his book, which is a very fine book, both on two grounds. Price, unfortunately, isn't one of those grounds, but I recommend it to you nonetheless. First of all, the fact that it gives you an excellent insight into some concrete case studies, because the data is very important in having these sorts of arguments, and Matt's done his due diligence very well in terms of studying three particular instances to tell us something about some broader themes, but also in contributing to what is a broad, long-standing debate about democracy promotion, which has many facets to it, and he's made a commendably good effort to link the lessons from some of those cases to these long-running arguments. And it's a book, to that end, which is about a number of tensions, as I would characterise it, that run through the idea and the practice of democracy promotion. So what I want to do first of all, I think, is maybe highlight three of what those tensions are, I think, that Matt rules out in the course of the book, and then maybe raise a couple of questions which my panellists will no doubt join me with eagerness in answering as we go on. The first tension is between what I call elections and democratic outcomes, which is to say majority rule through some kind of mechanism by which that might be achieved, versus liberal social forms and values. Which is to say, what is to be done if those who have won or would win an election, even if fairly held, aren't disposed to favour liberalism's tenets, which is to say things like tolerance of dissent, respect for the rights of other social groups, freedom for civil society, or perhaps even future elections after the one they've won under free conditions. Is it better to have a government that is popular, elected, legitimate, but illiberal in terms of the values that it holds? Or is it better to have a country which is governed by people, or which is governed by a system which lacks some of those qualities, but which is preserving a relatively liberal order, nevertheless within it? And that is a very real tension that manifests itself almost every time an election is held in one of these early stage democracies, I think, and therefore quite an important one. And two related questions that come up from that are, to what extent can description of a liberal country or preserving liberalism hold when it involves quite a lot of illiberal practice in order to do it, which is to say, if you're excluding certain parties, detaining people without trial, perhaps even using state-orchestrated violence with the justification that you're preserving liberalism against its internal enemies, how far can you go down that road before you start to essentially destroy a village to save a village and end up in that kind of territory? And then second of all, another question related to that is, I suppose, the age-old tension between the economic and the political strands of liberalism. To what extent can an elected government, while maintaining standards of political liberty, go down the road of, say, nationalising property or trying to redistribute wealth in relatively radical ways before those who are theorists and practitioners of liberalism in other parts of the world start weighing in and saying, this has gone awry somewhere, liberalism is no longer, this country is no longer free, I guess, in the parlance of people who monitor these things like Freedom House. So there's that tension between governments and the forms by which they're elected, and governments and the values they believe in and implement, I think, is one thing that Matt has drawn out very well. The second tension is between local autonomy and foreign expertise, I suppose one might call it. I think generally at least to judge by the amount of times it's cited. People in this field tend to agree with T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia, as Hollywood knows in his dictum, that something is better done imperfectly by them than perfectly by us, because the idea is that they own the product. Nevertheless, despite the fact that people say that, there is a question over how imperfect it has to get before we regard it as nevertheless an imperative to step in and do something to save them from themselves. Historically speaking, I think the answer's often been that we do want the locals to control the process, so long as they use that control to end up roughly where we wish them to do it, And if there are other priorities in other parts of the world that we want to engage in, and if the country in question becomes a low priority, things can tread water going the wrong way for quite a long time. But as soon as any kind of crisis arises or the country comes back onto the radar, questions swiftly start getting asked which centre on the talking point of why this country is going in the wrong direction and what might be done to change it, to put it back in the right track. Why should we be funding X country when they are doing Y things, often being the language through which it gets asked? In countries like Pakistan, for example, are at the forefront of a question like that at the moment. And the third tension, I suppose, is the one that Matt highlighted, which is one that I spend a lot of my life discussing in my capacity as a self-identified realist, which is a mug's game, I can tell you, is that between US values and US interests. I mean, it's the tiredest, most shop-worn of tropes nowadays on the part of policymakers to observe that it's a false choice between interests and values because they're harmonious. That is to say, the promotion of US values through liberal democracy and its spread is in the enlightened interests of the United States. And the practice of that, in terms of actually living up to democratic ideals and indeed trying practically to spread democracy all over the world, is not consistently to the front of American actions, but the trope that these two things are consistent and in line with each other. The idea of it seems to be absolutely essential to the American political culture. They just can't get away from saying this or get past it, no matter how much they might be taught lessons to the contrary by reality. And so both values and interests are regularly being reinterpreted and redefined with reference to one another in order to try and sustain the impression of harmony as facts on the ground change, which is a kind of blurring that leads to a lot of vagueness and opacity and difficulty in the reasoning that takes you to American policy positions which you've lamented to some degree in what you were saying there. And I think there is a distinction between values and interests, and it's quite an important one. I appreciate that it blurs a little bit around some of the boundaries, and people's unwillingness to accept that in policy spheres is a source of great regret to me, that I think it is to you. As a result of that, you get interventions which are essentially based on a combination of ideological antipathy and or a sort of desire to be seen to be doing something, which are dressed up as exercises in the defence of the national interest, which is redefined in some broad new way to encompass these things. I would say arguably that's the case in Libya. I have views on that we can discuss at more length later if we want to. And on the other hand, you have efforts to achieve fairly concrete strategic objectives, which end up being larded with all sorts of extraneous liberal issues, as I would argue, for example, debates about some of the internal issues of Afghanistan, like women's rights and so on, have become, which are essentially nothing to do with the strategic interests of the United States, but have become part of it in this internal American policy discourse. In reality, there are circumstances where it seems to me that it's perfectly possible to advance US objectives without living up to the highest moral hopes of American political figures, and often an ability to engage in a degree of dispassionate, amoral, if you will, calculation positively helps in your effort to further your strategic interests. This discourse of harmony is not terribly helpful. I think these tensions that I've outlined are between irreconcilable priorities are very real. They present themselves often in the form of a dilemma, which is to say that they're not really resolvable. The tension is inherent in the policies themselves. It's been noted by famous scholar William Appleman Williams that American liberalism has a sort of tragic quality, or an ironic quality, as Reinhold Niebuhr preferred to characterize it instead, in that it's not so much that there's a contrast between the light and the dark impulses of American policy and democracy promotion, so much as it's the same qualities that lend themselves to the virtue and the effort to achieve the good project. that actually lend themselves to that they contain within themselves the seed of the technocratic hubris that often proves costly both to American policymakers and to those who are on the end of their policy. So I think Matt's done a great job of showing how these tensions manifest themselves in some real concrete cases, where at different times the United States has interpreted its objective differently in light of shifting priorities, but where the strong senses of the nation trapped by an inability to shake the belief that deep down other people want nothing so much as to be more like us, which I think is the fundamental insight that seems to underlie a lot of these policies. And thanks to this, these tensions play themselves out recurrently in their interventions with consequences that are sometimes tragic, sometimes comical, sometimes cynical, and always expensive. Looking ahead, I'd say that there are some interesting questions which arise, and I'll be discussing with my fellow panelists, and a couple in particular that I had in mind. First of all, are US policymakers mistaken in their habitual statement that all peoples are the same fundamentally and want democratic freedoms as Americans understand them? I would say yes. To get us started, yes, they are. For some people, liberty in the American sense comes first. For other people, religious virtue comes first. For people who are stuck in war zones, it may be understandable that feel of stability or order over individually gifted democratic legitimacy might be a priority. These are things which have no absolute quality to them. There is no way of arbitrating between such things, and it seems to me an act of faith to suggest that other people deep down want one thing as opposed to what they say they want or consciously want. And from the point of view of a foreign power, for example, or in parallel, it may be entirely reasonable to prioritize other things on the part of another government than that it should be liberal and democratic. One might want that it should have orderly control of its society, command of its territory, autonomy from domination by other powers, the ability to crack down on, or at least a disinclination to support one's enemy's state or non-state within their own borders. These are all perfectly sensible things to want from another state. And an effort to make a state like any of those things seems to me as obviously good a goal as to make it democratic. It may be eminently possible that a state becomes more democratic indeed, while at the same time becoming less like some of those other things, and therefore more threatening to US interests. There is no obvious or axiomatic link between a country becoming more democratic and more pro-American or more useful from the point of view of American interests. So does the United States choose uniformly the path most amenable to its interests when faced with a choice between concrete practicalities and some of the phantasms of global order associated with trying to universalize democracy? Matt suggests that there is a tendency, at least in specific cases and on the ground, to always override with interests when democracy promotion is an alternative. As a realist, my instinctive reaction to that idea is I wish. I fear that sometimes the United States may well put its interests first, but the United States makes its own life rather difficult a lot of the time, I think, by the way it insists on reading its problems through the lens of the question of democracy and dictatorship. And albeit that, as Matt has noted, the definition of interests is certainly strikingly malleable in the hands of other people, it is that extension of the word interest to encompass things which I think are essentially irrelevant to the US interest, which causes the United States a lot of problems. So I don't think it does always prioritize interests over ideologies which we use might. The second thing, the final thing that I wanted to say, was a related question, which is it the best strategy for the United States, while admitting that obviously there are circumstances under which it may be strictly necessary to intervene in other people's territory, is it the best strategy of the United States to minimize, perhaps, its ownership of the question of whether other people's domestic arrangements, democratic or otherwise, satisfy them? Is owning other people's happiness with how their own countries work a good place to put yourself in the world? And I would say it's not, by and large. It may well be that some of these states, as you allude to in your book, need to go through a messy, bloody process of state building analogous to the experience that we've had in other parts of the world, wherein factions clash with each other over a period of many years. Eventually they establish a strong state, then against that strong state they push back and acquire liberal views. Or it may be that they're just messy and bloody. It may be that there isn't this progressive teleological movement from one place to another, and that after those many years of struggling with each other, they may have decided who will rule, but they won't actually be on any kind of train tracks towards liberty. I think the United States may have an interest sometimes in some specific cases in how those issues turn out, but I also think that it may well be a crucial error to allow yourselves to be in the position of seeming to have as much or more responsibility for the development of another country and its political culture than its own people do. And because the likelihood is that you will then be the locus of blame for people, for many problems which exist in all societies and which are not yours by instigation, which you now have ownership of as a result of your decision to take responsibility for social progress in another place. It's pretty rare for the United States to be especially loathed in those countries where it plays a small role. It's often in those places where it tries to do most, as if to see it to help, that it is most despised. And without wanting to sound like Ron Paul, I think there is a lesson in that somewhere. That intervention in small particular cases when there's local invitation may be one thing. Big picture, large bore efforts to remodel other societies based upon assumptions about what do people underlyingly want if only they realised it, which they will in decades' time, seem to me a very different case. So the chief lesson of cases like Afghanistan and Iraq, I think, and I think Matt might agree with me, is that such things simply shouldn't be attempted. And I think that's a view that the President of the United States, to his credit, as expressed in reference to the Libyan case, agrees with also. The concept of leading from behind is obviously an unfortunate phrase, and not one that I think anyone would in retrospect wish to use. But nevertheless, this was a war basically about reacting to a movement to try and overthrow a tyrant. It wasn't particularly a war about instituting a large-scale project to democratise another society. And it would be nice if the new guys who are running Libya turned out to be more liberal and more democratic. They could hardly turn out to be less liberal and democratic. That would be the dictatorship Olympics, I think, to attempt to get to that place. But it's scarcely essential that they should prove to be model democrats or anything close, so long as the United States doesn't get itself so tied up in turning it into a case study and becoming a model democracy that it then becomes embarrassing that it isn't one. So the chief lesson of these studies in democracy building, I would say, is that there should be less of it, at least less of it of the type that there has been thus far. These are often lose-lose scenarios where irreconcilable tensions of the sort that I described are at play, and certainly one should favour organic development of local structures rather than trying to impose blueprints from above. But I think in adopting that view that we have to allow the forces on the ground to take the lead rather than imposing blueprints, we should do it with our eyes open. The result may well therefore be something which isn't terribly liberal or terribly democratic, because it would be all very well to say, let them do it themselves and they build their democracy. Well, obviously the operative question is, suppose building a democracy or a liberal society isn't what they're doing. That's where the whole issue of foreign intervention tends to arise. So yes, less foreign intervention, but accepting the price of that may well be less democracy. And open one's heart to the fact that maybe that's kind of okay, at least from the point of view of the American national interest. That would be my view. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. We'll take room for
Thank you. So, I don't think I'm a realist. So, I find it less easy to sort of understand the world in a clear framework and sort of match the outcomes with the machinations and interests of power, particularly American power. But the issues that I think interest me more is how we understand the world so differently over quite small spaces of time, and why it is that we're all so critical of power today, and why we're also critical of what we call often like liberal frameworks of understanding. And I think it's interesting in the discipline of international relations or international politics, because in the outside world it doesn't seem that we're full of radical political engagement and struggle, and yet in academia we are very, very critical And I think it's interesting. And I think it's interesting exactly how critical we are compared to what we were thinking. And I don't mean in the Cold War, I mean in the 90s. In the 90s there seemed to be a sense of, now the Cold War is over, some of the problems of the world can be resolved, and all the international institutions are no longer hamstrung by America-Soviet rivalries. We can go beyond national interests and think of positive, progressive things. And obviously there was some exaggeration, possibly, but today I sort of, I yearn for that sort of go-getting, transforming, new beginning sort of thing. And it seems amazing how quickly we've become disillusioned, and not just disillusioned with our 90s, maybe slightly over-optimistic new beginning things, but disillusioned with ideas that we've held for hundreds of years about what was capable in terms of transforming our situation, in terms of how humans subjectively and collectively could engage with problems in the world and do something positive. And it seems, I slightly worry that we're so critical that we would rather like that the world just went away and you know, we could just be left doing our own things somehow. And we all think that less is more. We all think that even trying to do something, what would be the point? Because it will just make things worse. And I think what I'm beginning to think is that being critical isn't necessarily the same as being radical or progressive in some way. And I don't mean to say that let's have more American imperialism and world domination, but it just seems very interesting to me that we look at the world as if no one can do anything, and anyone that tries to do something is obviously suspicious. And maybe that's an academic view, because, you know, we do our own thing, we're not politicians doing policy stuff, and maybe we're always a bit suspicious of people active and engaged in the world. But I do sort of worry about how we're so critical now, whereas in the 90s, when there was actually a much more fundamental imperialist or neo-colonial aspiration to do things, people were much less critical. You know, that seems peculiar, but now we all reflect on it, and we all say, not all of us, but generally. I was at a meeting a couple of days ago, and leading professors and policy people were saying, how could we have thought those things in the 90s? That hubris of thinking that there could possibly be more development in the world, or more democracy in the world, the hubristic idea that somehow people with the wealth and the knowledge and the money and the power could possibly do something that would make some difference to other people's lives. How stupid we were. Anyway, and now we live in a world where everything seems to be so full of contradictions and problems that it just seems to us that it's better really to like not really do very much. And it's the irreconcilable tensions that we're drawn to. And I think maybe we could do with thinking about how we might understand the seeming impossibility of the world, the impossibility of human action, the possibility of the future being better than it is today. How it is that we sort of articulate that, and maybe reflect upon whether we can't sort of critically challenge that in some way. And so that's what I wanted to sort of look at. And I think that the negativity of our world is expressed well in the discussion of state-building intervention and democracy promotion. It's expressed well in all sorts of other areas as well. But with state-building, I mean, I work in the area, and normally what people say is that we know that leaving those people to themselves will be a disaster. We can pretty much guarantee that if we don't do something, that left to their own devices, there'll be some problem, conflict, diseases, environmental pollution, or whatever. And so we have to, we feel driven, we feel like we live in a global world, and we don't it's not like we need to do it because we love them, but also because we're concerned about our own security in a global, complex, interconnected world. So on the one hand, we're much more certain than ever before that we can't just leave things alone. And on the other hand, we're really, really certain that we can't actually make them better. And it's this grey area where we have a very negative view about them, and we have a very negative view about us. But equally, we're forcing ourselves to do this agonizing thing where there's always contradictions and tensions, because we know that we have to engage in this thing, that we have to do it. And there's this sort of sense of quite a bad conscience going on. And you wonder why anyone would be drawn to this particular area of work at all. It's hugely, hugely demoralizing. And I just want to draw out, well, I guess, you know, even, well, where to begin with the demoralizing nature of the debate. But even with democracy promotion, I think we could sort of begin with that, because it seems to me that how we understand those words has changed quite a lot. And that today, when we do democracy promotion, we're often very critical of everything we understood by democracy and autonomy and self-government. And I know it's a simplistic point, but it might be worth making that in the, say like in the Cold War, back in the days when everything seemed clear and linear, and we had all these liberal teleologies and stuff, there was these assumptions that people were capable of making some rational decisions and voting, and it wasn't like rocket science. And we sort of thought that what people needed was to be freed from oppression, that they needed the chance to vote, that we needed to get rid of military dictatorships and Soviet bureaucrats and one-party rule, and that actually once we did that, once there was an element of emancipation or liberation, that, you know, that people could use democracy. That's why people were into democracy. In fact, it's difficult to be a Democrat unless you sort of have those universalist ideas of people's capacities to make their own decisions. And now, of course, the biggest threat to democracy is elections. The biggest threat to democracy is people voting and having autonomy and organising their own government. And the critical people today, what they say is that, God, the foreign policy that we used to have would go in, get rid of the dictators, and then go again, and just leave them to have elections. And how stupid we were to think that democracy be a formal set of processes about self-government and about elections and things. And now we all think, how could we have been so stupid? And now we know that democracy's got nothing to do with those things. And we're all very critical of this formal idea of democracy. And what we think about when we do democracy promotion, the dangerous places where they really need democracy promotion are often countries that have this formal democracy, where they've already got elections. Every election they have is like a red rag, it's like a potential bomb going off, because there's problems that they could elect the wrong people, and they could be too nationalist, or they might abuse rights, and it's a dangerous thing. The things that we used to think were like good are now dangerous. And when we do democracy promotion, generally what we do is not about the formal thing. We think about culture. We think about civil society. We think about the institutions. And traditionally, this was a fairly conservative argument. Obviously, aristocrats and elites always say, oh, you can't trust the masses with democracy. You know, they're not really educated enough, and they'll be influenced by demagogues and all the rest of it. And today, we have people like Matthew, and I don't mean to be critical or anything, in the whole of our discipline, what we do when we do state building and democracy promotion is we're working on people's capacity to be able to safely have elections. You know, Paul Collier's, you know, democracy in dangerous places, all the rest of it. And our starting assumption, obviously, is that these people aren't really capable of knowing their own interests. They're not really capable of having freedom of information and freedom of political competition. And if we were to give them these freedoms, that would be very dangerous. And then what we argue, of course, is that formal democracy is easy. What's difficult is substantive democracy, the real content of democracy. You know, the civil society that's necessary, the institutional frameworks, the values, the cultures, the ideology, the civility, the sense of community, and these sort of things. Okay, you know, why are you bothering to do all this democracy promotion stuff? You're pretty much saying that most of the world are never ever going to be able to do this democracy thing. You've sort of moved the goalposts a little bit. And it's peculiar that at the same time as we redefine democracy as about a social capacity, a capacity, a capability to make safe decisions within safe institutional frameworks, but, you know, we bring democracy into the social, societal level. We take it out of the formal level of voting and self-determination and the rest of it. But at the same time as we do that, fundamentally critique democracy, we do that under the framework of how we need to export it. And what I worry about is that rather than being liberal or anything, we're sort of saying that people are dangerous. We're saying that people can't really have self-government and these freedoms because they're not very rational, they're not very capable, and we have to think about the social side, the culture and the social values. And I think there's concerns about that, because if we looked at our own societies in that way, we could get rid of our own democracy, let alone anyone else's democracy. And I worry that our critique of democracy promotion is actually a little bit elitist and conservative and anti-liberal. And I like the way that the seminar was old wine in new bottles, because I see that with the end of our liberal moment, of our post-Second World War liberal moment, really, of post-colonisation, sovereign equality, international law and all the rest of it, that we are going back to maybe a previous set of understandings of how we understand the problems of the world, how we understand economic differentials in social wealth, how we understand differentials in areas of conflict and areas of peace. And I worry that how we understand them is increasingly about culture and society and ideas and traditions and the whole of the past. That in our new susceptibility to case-related understandings, in our understandings of the difficulty of transforming the culture and understandings of the ideas, what we're really saying is that the liberal world is shrinking. And as that liberal world shrinks, we find it very difficult to understand how to spread our message. We understand it very difficult how to engage with the rest of the world. We understand it as very difficult to think about transforming the rest of the world. And I think that our liberal understanding is shrinking in terms of our understanding of other societies and in terms of our understanding of economic processes and economic development and the possibilities there as well. And what I worry about in the shrinking of the liberal world, if we were to understand it like that, or the withdrawal from the world, or the denial of possibilities of change and transformation and improvement, we go back to a very old-fashioned, very culturalized set of understandings that always starts from difference and how differences are reproduced through cultures, through the separateness of society. And that's what really sort of worries me, that in our critique of how we understand democracy promotion and America and the 90s and liberal internationalism, we're critiquing it, I think, not because we're subjectively conservative, not because subjectively we believe that people make their own differences and they make their own choices and that these cultures can't really be overcome. We do it because there seems to be nothing else left, as the framework of understanding of the Cold War, of left and right, seems to disappear. I think so does our intellectual and political imagination. And maybe in the questions we can look at these things more often, but I just find it amazing that now we look at the world and all we can see is complexity and difference and tension. And we're continually writing off the possibilities of progress and change. And what we're sort of saying is that maybe we just have to accept the world as it is, that maybe the world as it is isn't so bad, and maybe these differences and economic inequalities can't be overcome, and maybe it would be better for us to do less rather than do more, and to worry about it less rather than worrying about it more. And we become at home in a world where actually we can no longer really relate to the other. We can no longer really engage in a sort of a collective or a political understanding of the world that we live in. And that doesn't make it easy even for America to do a strategic foreign policy with a set of interests. I don't think that realism enables us to understand the world in the way that it did before, because the world isn't as clear as it was before. That's it.
Okay, well, three very interesting presentations. I can sense a desire to interact and engage on the panel, but I'm going to exercise my chair's authority and in true democratic style and bring the audience in. So I suggest that we have a Q&A session, and I'll allow some time at the end for the panelists each to have a friendly go at each other in their concluding remarks. Okay? Okay, who's going to start us off? Okay, Liz.
Oh my goodness, everybody's hand would shoot up. Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. And interesting to see so many things that both of you were saying, brought together in a way by what David was saying. It seems to me that one of the things that you were both talking about was this idea that democracy promotion is a game of spinning plates. And basically it's also a game of trying to do the right thing at the right time, as opposed to any place, any time. So there was this looking at it from that point of view. You know, you've got cart before the horse. Sorry, I hate all the expressions, but you know, they're pretty clear, people understand them. I don't know if I can ask a question, because I was so, please forgive me, I was so blown away by what you said, because it's so much about how I feel we are sort of shrinking in our liberal sense, but also we're afraid of the growth of this illiberalism around the world. We're either recognising now, or just it's becoming more entrenched. It's more and more us, and then less and less understanding of the other, and being. But I have to say to you, I frankly don't want to live in a world where we don't engage with other people, and we don't try and make some sort of effort to improve the lot of our fellow man. And I think if we go down the road of disengagement, or being Little Englanders almost, then I think that's going to be bad for democracy promotion. My question, I suppose, if I have one that can be clearly articulated at the moment, is the linkage between democracy and values. You're talking about essentially breaking that. You don't want that to be the case, it seems to me. But it also seems to me that without values, you can't recognise values that are shared by others. If you don't have your set of values, you can't seek out the values that others have. And in a way, surely it's much more to do with leading by example. We should be the best democracy that we can be, and encourage others to be the best democracies they can be, who are already democracies, rather than them going out and behaving in illiberal, exploitative. Nobody's mentioned capitalism, nobody's mentioned religion in this. So, yeah, not really a question, but are you trying to disengage democracy from values?
I think that's directed towards you, Adam, but I'm sure the others want to come in.
Well, do you want me to, shall I kick off? Sure. Well, I mean, quite the opposite in some ways. I think I'm trying to disconnect democracy from interests. I think what I'm saying is that if you want to build a liberal democracy in another country for whatever reason, then it is very clearly a value-laden project. It's based upon some attachment on your part to the idea that this is a universal value set, a transferable and good form of government. But it's much more debatable whether or not either success should be achievable in doing that, and certainly whether or not the processes and projects needed to try and pursue success in that contribute to your own national interests. If you're going to do something like spreading democracy, try and make the argument an honest one about the fact that you believe in a universal state of how people ought to be, and you're trying to roll it out through the use of state power in order to achieve it, I would say. Whereas at the moment we have a rather confused discourse where people are unprepared to own that really anymore, possibly for the reasons of the crisis of liberal self-confidence that David's alluding to, and therefore they dress it up in this 7-stage argument about how if we don't try and build democracy in Afghanistan, we'll have suicide bombers in Canary Wharf, which seems to me highly tendentious and in some ways to evade the need to engage with the universalistic and value-laden ideologies of liberalism that I think have to underpin that project if it's really to have meaning. So I think what I would say is it's all about values, both democracy at home and the effort to spread it, but let's not confuse the issue by trying to pretend our values and our interests intersect in this way and always having the argument indirectly through strategy. As to the question of leading by example, absolutely. I'm all for what I think is slightly disingenuously been termed by Walter Russell Mead the Jeffersonian tradition in American foreign policy, which is to say, if you want others to become democracies, demonstrating how democracy can work well in your own territory is a far better way of doing it than rocking up to their own borders with a Kalashnikov and a suitcase of dollar bills and saying, let me show you how this is done. I think example is a far superior method to instruction when it comes to democracy building.
Yeah, just a couple of things, just to kind of, I'm in agreement with Adam with regards to the relationship between democracy promotion and interests and values, and you know, I think Carruthers talks about it being a semi-disharmonious relationship, and this idea, this presumption that the two are equally important, by in a way disaggregating what democracy promotion is for the US government. I think what you're then finding out is why democracy promotion is being utilised. My argument would be that it's more being utilised for its promotion of national interests than necessarily for its you know, values and rhetoric. My question would be, I would rather have the US or any other country promote democracy because it believed that democracy promotion was the best thing for that country than not. But the point is that I'm working with a case study, and the US these are my conclusions about what that case study does. So,
good. I don't know. I think that the idea of national interest is a sort of a constructed one and a contested one, and to say that we do this because of our interests isn't necessarily hugely useful, because we understand what that might mean very differently at different times, you know, in different countries. And so what looks like, oh yeah, it must have been the interests, it sort of doesn't necessarily help us. It just redescribes it differently. And I sort of think that what we're watching, what we're seeing since the undercolony was actually a withdrawal from the world, not just in terms of the crisis of liberalism, but clearly the contestation of the Cold War made the world geopolitically important. And even though we imagine the world of the 90s as literally about intervention and democracy promotion, underneath that is the withdrawal from the world and what is going to be the alternative to us propping up these regimes and securing it because we're worried about the Soviets in Africa or all the rest of it. And what we find is really it's a diversification of responsibility. It's new regional institutions. It's how do we engineer some social changes. And it seems like always we sort of generally discuss things in the opposite way. There's much less at stake in the international sphere, which is why I think Libya, you know, reveals it a lot more. You know, leading from behind and no one having any strategy and let them do it themselves. Yeah, well, who cares anymore? You know, in the Cold War, all these things were vitally important, ideologically, politically, strategically, everything else. And that's why it's difficult to get a handle on these debates about intervention today, because basically no one cares. You know, most states would just rather let some NGOs be in charge of that stuff. And because A, they don't know how to articulate their interests in any clear way, and B, they don't really care anymore either. You know, it's like, it's weird to feel such a national interest sort of thing when you can see all states are saying, well, you know, we don't really have a lot of power. We'd rather give up our foreign policy to the EU and our, you know, and our central bank things. And But the world where states were like these subjects controlling and regulating and contesting, it seems to have hollowed out at least somewhat in terms of nowadays states often say, well, you know, we don't really have any interests and we don't really have any power, and we're just like you know, we like campaigning on some good issues and we try and get by. You know, don't you think that something has disappeared from all that? Even like elections, the contestation for power because states were so important and governments were so important. Now it's like no one really wants to be elected into power and have a program. It's a bit embarrassing when you're there because, you know, you're just there like being on a panel here. It's like states have lost their power to actually have a clear strategic sense of interests or of values, as far as I can see.
Okay, I'm sure you want to come back very briefly.
Well, I just wanted to ask David, what would a more robust, self-confident American action in the case of Libya look like from your point of view? Send in the ground troops with a manifesto and a new constitution?
I don't understand. Why can't a self-confident thing be, you know, who cares? And let's get on with Gaddafi and worry about something else that's more important. Why does a robust attitude have to be dropping bombs on someone? It just seems peculiar, the whole way that everything is so technically and immediately and materially manifested, as if going to war was more in your interest or more robust than, you know, having peace or something. What, you know, a robust understanding is an understanding of what your priorities are and what your interests are. You know, how to select. Now, one thing you might notice if you look at any foreign policy website, it's like a 5-year-old. Bring peace to the world, end poverty, think about the environment. It's like everything and you could possibly imagine is all there. And there's no way you could possibly think about priorities or issues or questions. And so you'd rather like do your foreign policy with some other think tanks and governments because you're all alone in the world trying to do foreign policy. It's, you must, you know, hang out with these people.
It sounds like what you're saying is simultaneously the United States needs to be more self-confident and assertive about the value of liberalism and need to spread it, but it should have expressed that through not intervening in Libya in any way.
I didn't say, I wasn't intending to make any normative comments about America should intervene or not intervene. I'm just an academic. I'm just trying to understand the way that these discourses change and why it seems to be so problematic for foreign policy to take clear strategic forms.
I think what's important in looking at the way that national interest is constructed by the US government is precisely because this is how they construct their definition of national interest. And I think that, you know, if the powers that be of the US government have an understanding of how they feel that their national interest or their values can be achieved in some way, then, you know, that's the rules of the game and that's how we deal with them. There's a different issue which is about constructing an understanding of how we think that the US government should alter its behaviour in order to accommodate some of the other issues that you discussed. So I think in looking at the engagement of the US in Libya, one of the reasons why they decided that they would play from the back was precisely because of the experiences that they'd had in Iraq particularly, but also in Afghanistan. So it's as a response to a particular action. This is why their current policies are as they are today. So I'm, you know, yeah.
Okay, we'll get the audience in. Any Kate, I think what I'm going to do with I think I will ask 3 people to give questions and who they're directed to. So Kate first, and yourself. Yeah.
I'll try and keep it as brief as I can.
Yeah, brief is good.
Yeah. Although there's obviously a lot to say. Just in response to the third speaker, I don't think it's any surprise that people are thinking twice about intervention since the 1990s, given the horrors of what's come in between. And, you know, just in the past few weeks in Iraq, the dozens and dozens of people that are still continue to be killed. I don't think there's any surprise that there's a reluctance to intervene given everything that's happened in between. Without wanting to state the obvious as well and sound like some undergraduate Chomsky acolyte or whatever, why is it that democracy promotion is applied to some countries and not to others? Why does it have to be democracy promotion at all? Why not? Why can it not be framed around something else like genuine economic and social development? And just to ask a more concrete question of Matt, you mentioned the question of local actors, and I'd be very interested to know about the local actors, you know, from your research that they interact with in Afghanistan, Bosnia and Iraq, your case studies. Who are these local actors? How are they selected? And of course, you know, the question behind that about their representativeness.
One at the back, one there. Okay, but did you want to ask the question? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to stick my head above the parapet here because I'm actually not an expert in this subject matter at all. But what I'm going to ask the panel is, do we still nowadays believe that the promotion of democracy is purely because we want the country that we're intending to help promote that democracy within, generally because we want them to have a democracy, or is there an ulterior motive?
Okay. Well,
coming from the realist school, is there any possibility that this sort of activity is going to continue given the financial weakness in the states and the Western democracies? They're already starting to talk about clawing back, saving money on the deficit, actually in defence and foreign policy, which is unheard of before. They're just not going to have the money to do this anymore. And therefore their national interest will be shaped by that reality.
okay, well, lots of meat there, so who's going to take the first slice? So you would do?
Chadley Kate.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. What's interesting about I think was you really kind of focus on something which I think is really important, and if I'm truthful, a large degree of these questions would be they're not fully developed in the book, but there's definitely areas, that local, international, you know, who are these local actors? Who dictates that these local actors are the ones that need to be engaged with? You know, is it, for example, the case of Ahmed Chalabi in Iraq? You know, he was the principal Bush guy, and he had no constituency, and so there were difficulties there. How are they selected? Sometimes from looking at it, because they speak English. I mean, it literally can get that point. So then, so the people on the ground, their construction of, you know, so these international actors, their construction of this world, of this political, local environment, is channeled through the various people they talk to. Now, the various people they talk to might have certain perspectives and prejudices, which perhaps the international actors that are engaging with them might not necessarily be aware of, and so there's those kinds of issues. Afghanistan's a good one with regards to how they are selected, because if you look at the parliament, in the first elections that were set up, with Hamid Karzai that was the chairman and then became the president, a number of those were responsible, or people had said they were responsible for human rights abuses. They were military commanders and warlords and so forth. And so the question is, if you're instituting a new political system in a country, and you want the population's buy-in, my understanding would be that there needs to be some kind of dividend. Now, if the dividend, if you're looking at these political actors that are in control, and they're having these human rights abuses, and this is supposed to be a democratic government with a democratic culture and so forth, and you have these ideals of what this democracy is about, there's a disconnect. And so the idea, you know, the International Crisis Group has talked about this particular issue, and that said that, you know, the drop in voter turnout from the first set of elections to the second elections was dramatic. And as a and one of the suggestions, and I agree, is because of the disenfranchisement of the people. And that's because the people that were selected weren't necessarily of the mind to represent this new political system. But then that's the dangers of the compromises you have to get with the actors in that situation before you even get to a place where you can even think about democracy. Because you need co-op, you need buy-in from these actors. But yeah, and I'll leave the national interest and financial constraints to that.
Thank you very much. I know it's fine to be a wholly owned subsidiary of mine, but it's fair to make them that way. Well, to look at a few of those questions. First of all, do we do what we do in order to, because we really care about the democracy of other countries per se or not? Well, I think probably, you know, who am I to speak on behalf of the motives of all states at all times? But I think a lot of it is subtler than that, or more cynical than that, depending on how you want to put it. That there's a particular kind of world order with a set of interests attached to it that we favour. And we like states and people within states who, broadly speaking, cooperate with that, and we tend to dislike states and people within them who don't. And in particularly difficult cases where either a state or people within a state are being uncooperative, we believe, possibly kidding ourselves, that the thing that would make them more cooperative is democratization. We think that we tend to diagnose the reason why countries like Iraq, or today still Iran, are not buying into the self-evidently mutually beneficial project that is Western liberal hegemony. It is diagnosable to the flaw at the heart of them, which is their lack of democratic institutions, which is obviously not true, because Iran is in many ways far more democratic a country than Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia buys into the Western agenda entirely, and Iran not at all. So I think it's far more complicated than that. But it is deeply ingrained within American political culture to believe that with democratization comes a degree of cooperative temperament with regard to the liberal order, broadly speaking. And that's probably the reason why I think they favour it. I don't think it's a very accurate belief, but it's one that they do attach themselves to. With regard to the second question about the future, yes, as I will be saying when I come back in 2 weeks' time, and the money is running out. And, you know, well, one of the main reasons why the money is running out is because such an unbelievable amount of it's been squandered on achieving something approximating nothing, or worse than nothing in Iraq over the course of the last 10 years. I mean, it's just mind-boggling how much, fiscally speaking, is gone on that campaign. Whether or not that means there won't be sort of wars in the periphery and crises provoke them, we're all seeing Iran in the news, and obviously there are certain things that any power can do that make it just necessary to have a war, if they close the Strait of Hormuz or something like that. But something so manifestly a war of choice and started effectively by the beating of the Western war drum, I think is less likely, because within America you can see the Republican Party, which was in lockstep behind this kind of bellicose neoconservatism 10 years ago, is asking questions itself now about how you pay for these things, which is a very Republican way into the issue, obviously, but it still means you're less likely to get it. On the other hand, there are rising powers in the world who are much more wealthy than they used to be, who have massive military investment programs ongoing. The Chinese will have a modern military in American parlance within 10 years. At the moment, they set their stall out around believing in sovereignty and non-interventionism and the importance of not getting involved in these sorts of things. But lest we forget, the United States, for the first 100, 150 years of its history, thought that it was immensely important that we don't intervene in other people's affairs and did avoid that sort of thing. And it took, you know, a series of events and a few ideological turns on ninepence, and you know, we ended up where we ended up. So I, for one, will watch with interest how the rising powers of the world adapt their non-interventionist philosophies to their increasing capacity to intervene should they see fit to do so. Just one final thing to mention in reference to the first question that was asked. Putting concrete issues like development ahead of imposing Western ideal standards of democracy, that's precisely what Barack Obama, God love him, has been trying to do in some of the statements he's been making. Some of his policies are still getting into other people's business a bit more than I personally would care to, but he's certainly gone from one D word to another D word as a matter of policy, on paper at least.
Dave?
It's difficult to take up, but anyway, I have to do that, it's my job. But this critique of power thing that realists do trumps people as well. I just think that we just tend to over-egg the pudding a bit and really exaggerate the power of power, and And we rewrite history so quickly that, so this, like, you made the point, and Matt makes it as well, about this leading, I think it's leading from the back. Well, it's obvious, you know, that's just a response to Afghanistan, Iraq, and all the rest of it, as if that was all leading from the front. But at the time, we recognised that as leading from the back, and that was, you know, a pulling back from the Kosovo, Bosnia thing. And it seemed at the time that the Americans didn't know what they were doing, you know, that they didn't have any plans for anything, and certainly not colonising and all the rest of it. They wanted to hand Afghanistan over to the UN, and the UN refused, and that sort of thing. Iraq, as we know, they knew so little and cared so little about what happened there, that they thought they'd be greeted with roses and that sort of thing. And now, of course, we rewrite it, and yeah, those were huge plans and strategies of imperial domination, and we'll be doing that for Libya, God knows. You know, the ability of the left and the radical critics to give meaning to fairly arbitrary and ad hoc actions, it never ceases to astound me. And what I particularly like is this playing from the back thing as either a bit disingenuous or as just a temporary response. And I love it, particularly in IR, because we understand everything in international relations from the last thing we looked at in international relations. And so we're thinking about the Libya, are they really serious when they say they have to secure themselves and all that? But I think we could look more broadly at discourses of power. And it seems to me that there's a broader shift to playing from the back. And in terms of, I was trying to get at some of our broader liberal discourses of power and security, we've had a sort of a shift from a state-led understanding of security and state securing us in the Hobbesian, Leviathan social contract way, to more of a sort of a resiliency understanding. And we do community security. And we understand now that our general threats, whether it's diseases or flooding or terrorism, all the rest of it, that it's about communities securing themselves, or because it doesn't matter really what you want to focus on. And that's all sort of leading from behind. That's all a shift from states' liberal frameworks of understanding of how the world should work. And I don't know why. It's not my fault. I wish I could be as radical and critical as other people, but you have to sort of sometimes look at the world and say, actually, power is articulating itself differently, and therefore how we might be critical might be different. And so my feelings, rather than exaggerating power, I would rather look at the problems of this understanding that, we shouldn't be doing things, that we can't do things, and particularly a critique of this subsumption of politics into the social. And what you say about development, and Matt says as well, yeah, we talk about democracy or development, we mean the same thing now. I don't know if you come across Amartya Sen, he's sort of Nobel Prize winning development theorist. It's development is freedom. Development and democracy about the social empowerment of the individual as a choice-making subject. They're not about the old world of economic development or about formal democracy. And I think that we should maybe take seriously this thing about leading from behind and the inability of power to articulate itself in traditional ways, and exactly how harmful and reactionary that is. And fair enough, it's bad when, at least when power is doing power, we can oppose it in a traditional lefty-right thing. But I just think that we should be open to other ways that power might be exercised that are different to the 70s.
Okay. Questions? One last question? Yeah.
Well, just thinking about the current geopolitical framework, when I look at it, I think Iran is probably the most likely candidate for military intervention next, whether it's liberal intervention or just straight out military intervention. There must be a sense where people in the US are kind of hoping for another uprising, where you give them an excuse to go in and knock out the Revolutionary Guard and really decimate the military capability. Is that kind of, at some level as well, that's beneficial for Iran in some way? You could argue that that takes away one major impediment to social change within the country. So, which potentially means democracy promotion down the road without the West particularly having to do it themselves. Is that an element of strategic outcomes marrying with ideals?
Would it take that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't know. But I think there are a couple of things that I think are interesting in looking at that. And I think the first one is you have to, if there's some kind of liberal intervention, or there is some kind of intervention to a varying degree, the first question you have to ask is it going to be the US alone? And I really don't think the current political situation, both domestically and internationally, would create the environment or the conditions that the US would do that. Second is, like, would they get, so if it's not America on their own, who else would be involved? Well, is Britain going to be involved in itself? Is Russia? Is China? Well, I don't think so. And so the question is whether or not that becomes then a legitimate potential for engagement, for invasion. The second thing is listening to cases of, particularly the case of Iraq, and also the current case in Syria. I was speaking to a number of people recently about the US engagement in Syria, and the question is that the Syrian people that were feeding back to the US government were, we don't want your involvement. And I think that I wonder if that would be a similar thing with regards to Iran, which would be that the Iranian people that the information was feeding back to the international world and the US was like, we don't want your involvement or engagement. And actually, in order for the US to say it has a particular national interest, or a interest to subvert the current political system or support the opposition in Iran, I don't necessarily think that end goal is achieved by the US engaging militarily in various ways, or supporting the military involvement in Iran. I don't see how there's a connection, and that it would actually conflate the issue and make it even more difficult for the idea of Iran coming on board to the international global system if there was military engagement.
Okay. Do you?
Yeah, sure. Again, like Matt, I should caveat it with I don't know. I don't have access to the truth on this one. As he has said, military intervention in Iran in response simply to a domestic uprising, they're tough sell in American domestic politics at the moment. Something that, like a military confrontation about something hard, like a shutting of the shipping lane that spirals into regime change just de facto, I think might be envisageable. It's quite party political at the moment in the United States, in that a lot of Republican nominees are saying some stuff which, if translated into the mouth of the president, would be, war tomorrow. But one doesn't know how much that would carry over if they actually got into policy, and they have to start thinking about congressional approval. Where does the money come from? The military tend to be quite sceptical about it at the moment as well, so difficult to know. The current president certainly is no fan of the idea. If he was going to go down that road, he had every opportunity to do it 2 years ago and decided not to. I think the one thing I would put down as a marker is that, it wouldn't be any surprise to anybody who's heard what I've said today that I believe this, but the issue with Iran, and the reason why Iran is such a difficult case, isn't particularly to do with its non-democratic status. It is, by the standards of the region, certainly until recently, a relatively democratic country. By no means a model, but they have elections from a restricted list of candidates, and they have many rival power centres, neither of which many other countries can say. So the issue would be who from amongst the population of Iran is replacing the government, and what are their views on some of the main neuralgic points, like the nuclear program, which, for example, is fervently supported by many of the opponents of the regime in Iran.
If I may, it just seems there's been a massive change in rhetoric, even within the Obama administration in the last few months. They're talking about red lines that can't be crossed, and insiders say that they're coming more around to the Israeli perspective even. So I'm wondering more, would it be a good excuse that, like, if there was another popular uprising, that they can say, well, we've got to knock out their army so that they can't kill their own civilians, which is beneficial in their own strategic sense because it modifies Israel and makes them less of a threat in the Middle East. So I mean it more as kind of an excuse rather than, okay, we've got to go in and promote democracy in Iran.
Quite the key question would be, they would need a UN resolution, and I just don't see China or Russia supporting that, or not turning up for the vote.
I think the number one hope, if they wanted regime change, I think, would be that under pressure of economic sanctions, increasingly tight ones, and the regime in Iran clearly seems to be quite rattled, that they will lash out in some poorly thought through way outside their own borders, which then opens the door to self-defense arguments, much less controversial international peace and stability ones. But anything that ends with an Iraq-style, we own this, we broke this, we own it kind of scenario is a nightmare scenario for American planners of all parties and all institutions. I think it's the last thing they want. It's almost the one thing worse than a nuclear Iran might be a non-nuclear Iran, that America suddenly has owner-occupier status or the foreseeable future. Did you want to do closing statements?
Yes, I think it is a good idea because we stand between you and the happy hour, so to speak. What I'll do is I'll ask David if he wants to make a closing statement of, say, 2 minutes, and pass on to Adam, and we'll give you private place with the last word. Matt.
So, yeah. So my view is that it's very difficult to think radically and critically about how we advise the American government to promote democracy in some way. And I think that there's a more fundamental problem of our limited horizons and our understanding of change today. So maybe I'm just saying this because that's what I do anyway, but I sort of think our main problem is our socialising of political and economic questions, where we understand that culture and society comes first. And even, I noticed even in Matthew's book, which I didn't big up, but I think it's a brilliant book, and I've always, with my students here, they will say that I've been recommending that they have a look at this book. But even here, where there's the structural critique of sort of idealist, leader-orientated transition, structure is understood as culture and ideas, and it's sort of, we increasingly make culture and ideational frameworks the structure in which we understand the problems of the world. And I'm sort of thinking that if we really wanted to do critical work and see what the actual limits of possibilities are, we'd have to rebuild a more militant materialist understanding, because, and maybe get back to some of the things that we lost in our thinking of international relations and our theorising, as with the end of the Cold War we sort of became more of a sociological discipline than one that deals with more political and philosophical issues. So I don't have a lot of big policy advice, but I think there are some major problems that we need to think about.
Well, I don't know if I'm radical or critical. I may even be in some ways small c conservative on this particular issue. Certainly, I am sceptical about some of the tenets of liberalism, and unashamedly so. I mean, two in particular, I suppose. This is not unique to liberalism, but many others have it. The idea of progress with a capital P, the idea that there is a direction in which things go. I believe in change, but I believe change simply means things becoming not as they were, and that can be going back to the way things were in the past. It can be getting better, it can be getting worse, it can be taking on forms that we don't yet know about. Not all of it is good, and in different places it will not all be in the same direction. So I believe in change, and I believe in the passage of time. I don't know that I believe in progress in any of the teleological senses many liberals mean it. I don't particularly believe in universalism in any objectivist sense either, the idea that all people want the same things if only they knew it. The idea that all people have an end point of rights and preferences if only they are enlightened enough to be taken to that destination. I don't think that that's particularly true either. Different people, through their own stories, their own histories, their own circumstances, come to very different points of view about what's important, and those changes and those differences may maintain themselves over the course of indefinite time. But a big part of what we have been thinking about in terms of liberal interventionism over some years is the idea that somehow if you spontaneously liberate people, they will gravitate towards pursuing progress defined in that teleological way, and gravitate towards those liberal assumptions about universal wants that we all have, which correspond to liberal forms. And we define our interests as a nation and in our foreign policy based around pursuing that agenda or creating that space to allow people to pursue that road. I obviously think that's misguided, both normatively and as a matter of practice. And the final point I would make is that looking at what happened in Iraq, where we removed a government, created effectively a vacuum, and hoped and assumed that something resembling liberal norms viewpoints would spontaneously emerge from the population on the ground there. I think anyone who saw the events that unfolded there and didn't at least pause for thought in their self-confidence about the need for the radical liberation of people's liberal instincts worries me somewhat, because it is very clear to me that a lot of factors that were not accounted for in certain liberal viewpoints on how society works made themselves very forcibly felt in very concrete terms at the cost of a lot of lives in that place. And I think a degree of conservative thinking about the way society works and can change, about the diversity and pluralism of what different actors may want when provided the space to pursue it, possibly with violence in a vacuum, is an important takeaway for us from the events of recent years.
Thank you. There.
Okay, I want to touch on a couple of things. The first one is perhaps in opening the dialogue with David with regards to the idea of formal democracy and substantive democracy, which my understanding of the democracy promotion is about supporting both the formal aspects of democracy, so that institutional framework, which doesn't have culture as an aspect, but also the political and social culture of the population and the political framework and the constructs, and then the connection of those two together. That's my understanding of how I think that in a kind of ideal world, that's the way in which you project some idea of how you promote democracy. And so the criticisms are a failure. Taking that on board as my kind of standpoint, it's those failures to then address those issues, which is where I'm coming from. I think that kind of developing from what Adam was saying, this idea that Afghan or Iraqi or a number of different countries, that they perceive that democratic consolidation, all governments or systems perceive that democratic consolidation is, or the presumption by the US that democratic consolidation will happen in these countries and have an optimistic view that it will happen. But their optimism is not necessarily based on the fact that they're willing to put the effort in. So it's actually, so the optimism comes from the fact that everyone has this idea, or everyone has the educational experience, and that's formal or non-formal educational experience of what it's like to be an individual within a democratic system. And if they don't have that experience, and then to assume that they can easily pick it up without any instruction, and for it to be externally imposed, I think leads to me a couple of questions. And I know that there is a criticism of me saying that of that view, which is that I'm being ethnocentric, and I recognise that there's that criticism. I think that these ideas, these terms that I've used from other people, formal democracy, restricted democracy, basically that thing in the middle, if you see that polar of there being democracy and there being dictatorship, if there is a polar that these countries inhabit this grey zone, I don't necessarily think that that lineation is a particularly useful one to do, because I think these countries can quite happily stabilise in their ideas of their semi-democracy, or their, however you want to term it, their political state as it is. They can operate and function quite well. And I think that there's a number of examples where that happens outside of these cases. I think recognising that, then the presumption that consolidation of democracy can happen in these countries, when actually the way they're operating is quite successful and stabilised, you're assuming that democratic consolidation is the end goal. That's our assumption that we're making, and that might not necessarily be the assumption of the individuals or the political elites in those countries. So yeah, that's...
Okay. Well, the clock's beaten us. I'm sure we could go on much longer, which is a sign of the interest that has been sparked by the debate. I'd like to thank the audience for engaging so well with the panellists. I'd like to thank the panellists for such stimulating presentations, and of course I congratulate Matthew for being the source of it all. Certainly I will take away from this my understanding of democracy promotion confirms what I've always felt the fundamental truth of social science. There are two basic questions in social science. One was posed in 1906 by the now obscure Russian revolutionary V.I. Lenin. What is to be done? But before you can answer that question, you have to address the one posed by the eternally great Marvin Gaye in 1970, what's going on? So thank you very much. Let's show our appreciation.